Welcome to Sci-Fi Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Facts and step beyond the screen. They want to know how quickly Mark can move into human trials. Having already recognized the weapon's potential, Mark isn't comfortable with where this is headed. He doesn't believe technology like this should exist purely to hurt people. His superior pushes back, reminding him that DARPA answers to the government, and whether he likes it or not, military use comes with the territory. Before the argument can go further, new orders arrive from the army. Mark is being deployed to Moldova because something has gone seriously wrong with the hyperspectral goggles he built. Shortly after, he touches down at the American base in Chisinau, where he meets General Orland and CIA officer Fran. Orland doesn't waste time. He shows Mark the unsettling footage recorded moments before a soldier's death. On screen, a translucent figure flickers into view, but what really grabs Mark's attention is something else entirely, glimpsed only briefly right before the apparition appears. Orland tells him their cameras have been catching similar shapes around the city for almost 3 weeks. Everyone initially chalked it up to glitches or interference, but after one of their best soldiers turned up dead, it became clear something far more serious was going on. The autopsy only deepened the mystery. The man's internal organs were frozen solid, while the outside of his body showed burns and corrosion. More bodies have surfaced in the following weeks, all in the same bizarre state, and even their Moldovan military counterparts are stumped. There's another odd wrinkle too. At several of the death sites, local teens have spray-painted the words genocide on the walls. Orland explains that terror comes from local folklore, referring to ghosts of war. The CIA's leading theory is that these figures are enemy soldiers using some kind of cutting-edge cloaking tech, though that still doesn't explain how they're killing people in such an impossible way. Mark isn't ready to jump to conclusions. He wants a better look at the phenomenon before he'll commit to any theory. Fortunately, he came equipped. He's brought along a hyperspectral camera, a far more powerful cousin of the goggles, capable of reading much deeper into the light spectrum. Orland clears him to head into the field with a Delta Force unit, tasked with locating another team that vanished the day before. Mark starts mounting the camera to the roof of a military truck, and the soldiers aren't thrilled about it. They joke that the civilian scientist is turning their vehicle into a science experiment. Captain Cabrera, who knows Mark personally, quickly shuts down the ribbing, reminding everyone that Mark's team helped design the very trucks they rely on. Major Sessions is a tougher sell. He's not keen on bringing a civilian into a combat zone and warns Mark that his tech had better help them this time, not create more headaches. At the mission briefing, the team learns the missing unit was last known to be inside a 5-story apartment building, with contact lost the previous day. The neighborhood is insurgent territory, so armed resistance is expected before they even reach the building. Their orders: neutralize any anomalies they encounter, but the priority is finding survivors and getting everyone out alive. Fran insists to the room that the anomalies are almost certainly enemy fighters using advanced camouflage. Mark tries to push back, but she cuts him off and announces she'll be accompanying them into the field. Mark's assigned to stay in the truck, monitoring the soldiers' helmet cam feeds as they clear the building. The convoy reaches the apartment block without incident, and the early search turns up nothing. The lower floors are empty and quiet, but deeper in, they start finding bodies, both American soldiers and insurgents, all killed in the same unnatural fashion as the earlier victims. Then Cabrera spots movement on the sensors. The team carefully flips over an overturned bathtub and finds Sergeant Comstock underneath, terrified but alive. He tells them the rest of his unit is dead, their bodies upstairs, and insists a traumatized that whatever attacked them wasn't human. To him, it felt supernatural. The team pushes up to the next floor and finally spots one of the translucent figures. A soldier opens fire, landing every shot, but the bullets do nothing. Now the thing doesn't flinch, doesn't slow, doesn't bleed. It simply walks through him, and he drops dead instantly. The creature then turns on the rest of the squad. Their weapons are useless against it, and the men start falling one after another. Watching through the camera feeds, Mark tells them to pull out immediately. Staying inside is pointless. Fran argues they need more intel before retreating, but Mark counters that they won't learn anything if everyone dies first. Inside, with bullets doing nothing, the soldiers resort to grenades, hoping the blasts will at least slow the creature down. Cabrera realizes the mission is unsalvageable and orders a full retreat. The survivors grab the wounded and lower themselves out a window using cables, but even outside they're not safe. The Spectre follows, killing anyone within reach as they try to escape. By the time they reach the truck, only a handful are still alive, and the thing is still chasing them. For Mark, though, this becomes his first real opportunity to get clean footage with the hyperspectral camera. As the image sharpens, he studies its form more closely and realizes it's not just a blur or an energy distortion. That has a distinctly human shape, and disturbingly, a complete human face. That detail rattles him. Cabrera rushes out to attack it himself, firing point blank, but the shot has no effect as the creature passes through him and kills him instantly. His sacrifice buys the others just enough time to reach the truck and climb aboard, and they tear away from the building. As they drive, Mark presses Comstock about what happened before the rescue arrived. Comstock explains he hid under the bathtub for hours, too terrified to move, and that he saw the Spectre himself. But before he can say more, the truck jolts violently. They've driven straight into a mine zone. The blast flips the vehicle, killing Comstock, who hits his head in the crash, along with the drivers. Amid the chaos, Mark grabs the hyperspectral camera, knowing it might be their only remaining tool for detecting the creatures. With the truck totaled and the area still dangerous, the survivors take shelter in a nearby abandoned factory. Their radio contact with base is weak and unreliable, leaving them cut off and surrounded by a threat they barely understand. As the group catches its breath, they start piecing together what they saw. It becomes harder and harder to keep calling it advanced camouflage. Even the soldiers admit it felt supernatural. Mark isn't fully convinced, but he can't deny the strangeness either. He notes the figure's human-like form and the way it seemed to look directly at him, suggesting some kind of awareness and maybe even intelligence. It didn't behave like a machine or a random phenomenon. It seemed conscious. Beyond that, though, he still has no answers. The crash destroyed the soldiers' goggles, leaving them blind to any specters outside, but Mark's hyperspectral camera still works. He sets it up to scan the surrounding area, and what he sees is chilling. Several specters are circling the factory, trying to get in, but stopping short of the building itself. The camera reveals why someone has scattered a ring of iron filings around the structure, and whenever a specter tries to cross it, the iron seems to hurt it, pushing it back. Someone built this barrier deliberately, before they can figure out who. A noise from another room sends the soldiers rushing in, weapons ready, and they blast the door open only to find two terrified civilians hiding inside. A young woman named Sari and her younger brother, Bogdan. Neither speaks English, but Fran understands their language and translates. The siblings have been hiding there alone. In the same room, the team finds a transmission tower capable of broadcasting a signal across a 20-mile radius, powerful enough to reach anyone nearby, friend or foe. Sessions decides the risk is worth it. It's their best shot at rescue. While the soldiers work the tower, Mark talks to Sari through Fran. She explains that her father built the iron barrier around the factory and believes the specters are lost souls trapped between life and death. Mark is less interested in the folklore and more focused on the practical question: how did her father know iron would work? He asks to see the man himself. Sari agrees to take him and Fran to another part of the factory, leaving Bogdan behind with the soldiers unaware that his father is already dead. Sari has been shielding him from the truth. Bogdan believes their father left to find help, but in reality he died while setting up the barrier, and Sari had to drag his body back inside herself. Mark examines the body and finds a necklace with a small ceramic tile, along with a map pointing to a district called Mazarov, near the river. Sari doesn't know how her father figured out iron would work, but she does know Mazarov is where the first sightings began. Later, the team finally gets a response from base. Rescue is coming at dawn, with helicopters and tanks meeting them at an open plaza about half a mile away. The news should be a relief, but it sparks a new argument how the plaza offers almost no cover, and if the Spectres attack there, the team could be wiped out before help even arrives. Mark starts working on a way to even the odds. Since the factory is full of iron filings and iron clearly hurts the Spectres, he proposes packing the filings into makeshift bombs. He also converts his hyperspectral camera into a powerful searchlight capable of revealing the Spectres as they move through the streets, and sends the modification instructions back to base so the rescue team can build their own and avoid flying in blind. As everyone gets ready to move, Sari finally tells Bogdan the truth about their father, handing him the necklace. The weight of it finally hits him, but there's no time to grieve. A strange sound started coming from outside. The team switches on the new searchlight and sees the Spectres climbing the neighboring building, using power lines to cross over the iron barrier entirely, bypassing the protection without ever touching the ground. The group moves immediately. Sari leaves them to a back exit, hoping to slip away before the creatures close in, but the Spectres find them anyway and keep hunting even through the rear door. Mark swings the searchlight onto the approaching figures, making them visible to everyone at once, finally giving the soldiers something to shoot at. Loaded with iron filing rounds, their weapons actually work this time. The shots land real damage, though the force of the impact is strong enough to knock some of the soldiers off their feet. To buy more time, they fire extra rounds into the air ahead, creating a metallic dust cloud that slows the Spectres and lets the group keep moving. Following Sari's lead, they push through the streets and reach the open plaza, taking cover inside an abandoned bus. Mark checks the searchlight and finds the battery nearly dead, a serious problem, since it's their only way of spotting the creatures coming. Tension builds as the group hears something heavy approaching outside. It turns out to be good news. The rescue tanks have arrived, equipped with their own searchlights built from Mark's instructions. As the beams sweep the buildings, they expose dozens of Spectres lurking above and around the plaza, and the rescue force opens fire immediately. Forced to move fast amid the explosions and gunfire, the group inside the bus doesn't get a chance to properly warn the new arrivals about what they've learned. The rescue soldiers charge in with standard weapons, which as expected do nothing, and the mistake costs them heavily. Most of the newly arrived troops are killed, and the Spectres turn on the tanks too, smashing their searchlights and tearing through the armor. Amid the carnage, Mark notices something important. The Spectres can't pass through the ceramic components of the tanks. Just like iron, ceramic seems to affect them in a very specific way. The survivors need to get out immediately, but then they realize Bogdan is missing. He'd gone back for his father's necklace after dropping it. Sari spots him and sprints after him, desperate to reach him in time, but before she can, a Spectre passes straight through Bogdan. Mark rushes over to check on him, but it's too late. He's gone. Fran holds Sari back as she breaks down, unable to process losing both her father and her brother in the same day. Meanwhile, the Spectres begin gathering in the center of the plaza, as if regrouping for one final assault. For a moment it looks like the end for the survivors, outnumbered, exposed, and nearly out of options. Then the helicopters arrive. As they descend, Mark notices the rotor washes, making it hard for the Spectres to advance. Seizing the opening, he smashes every remaining iron grenade against the ground, letting the rotor wash carry the metal dust straight into the creatures and hold them back just long enough. The team scrambles aboard the helicopters and finally escapes the plaza. Once airborne, they learn they're not headed back to the American base. It's been compromised, but to a refugee bunker instead. Looking down, they watch the city fall apart beneath them, Spectres spreading chaos through the streets of Chisinau. At the bunker, guards initially train their weapons on the newer arrivals, unsure who they are, until Fran talks them down in their own language. Once inside, the soldiers secure the entrances and defensive positions. Mark and Fran bring Sari to a doctor to treat a shrapnel wound in her shoulder from the escape. While she's being treated, Mark tries to distract her from the pain, telling her he managed to recover her father's necklace from Bogdan and returning it to her gently. He presses her further about her father and what he knew, but she doesn't have much more to offer, only that he made ceramic containers for Mazarov, the power plant where the specters first appeared. Before they can dig deeper, a heavy thud outside sends everyone bracing for another attack, but it's General Orland, arriving with a handful of survivors from the destroyed base and whatever gear they managed to salvage. Orland explains that the base was overrun by the invisible figures, with only 19 people making it out, and there was no time to contact command or request support. For now, the plan is simply to fortify the bunker and hold. That answer sparks tension. Some soldiers want to strike back immediately, while others argue that rushing out without a real plan will only get more people killed. Before the argument escalates, Mark cuts in and the pieces have finally clicked into place. Comstock survived because he was hiding under a ceramic bathtub. The specters couldn't pass through the tank's ceramic parts either. They're vulnerable to iron. They radiate a cold intense enough to kill instantly. They can pass through solid walls, yet ceramic stops them cold. To Mark, all of that points to one explanation: Bose-Einstein condensate, a rare state of matter first theorized by Satyendranath Bose and Albert Einstein. Producing something like that would take an enormous amount of energy, which explains the connection to the Mazarov power plant. Mark concludes these aren't ghosts at all. They're a weapon, an experimental one, somehow unleashed by the enemy. He reasons that if the specters were built with human technology, there must be a way to destroy them too, which brings him back to a device he'd finished just before shipping out, a wave-based weapon capable of tearing materials apart. If he can rebuild a version of it here, it should be able to hit the specters with a plasmic discharge strong enough to break them down. He proposes building several of these weapons using whatever gear Orland's team salvaged, plus anything they can strip from the bunker itself. The soldiers immediately start scavenging cables, batteries, circuit boards, and tools, and Mark turns the bunker into a makeshift workshop, assembling as many weapons as he can. Among the recovered equipment, they find a robot the soldiers nickname the Mechanical Rottweiler, and they mount one of the modified searchlights on it for mobile detection in the field. Fran gathers intel from the bunker's local residents to help the group plot the safest air route to the Mazarov power plant. It's a dangerous mission, but everyone understands there's no alternative if the plant is the source. Stopping the specters means going straight to where they were made. Before departure, Orland rallies the soldiers with a rousing speech about what they're fighting for. The team then flies to the power plant. On arrival, the Mechanical Rottweiler sweeps the platform with its searchlight, revealing the first wave of incoming specters, and the soldiers test Mark's new weapons on them, this time with real success. The plasmic discharge tears through the creatures and destroys them completely. With the weapons confirmed to work, the other two assault teams move into position, and soon every platform around the plant is locked down. The soldiers hold the line against wave after wave of specters while the helicopter carrying Mark, Fran, and two guards pushes into the facility itself. They're attacked almost immediately, and with pressure mounting, the group splits as the two soldiers stay to hold the creatures off while Mark and Fran press deeper to find the lab, buying time with no guarantee the defensive line will hold. They eventually reach a heavy armored door, which Fran manages to hack open. Inside the main lab, it's clear something terrible happened. Every scientist is dead. Searching the room, they find X-ray scans showing the researchers had been mapping human bodies down to the molecular level, then using a specialized 3D printer to recreate people in condensate form. This isn't just a research facility, it's an assembly line for manufacturing the specters as weapons. Deeper in, Mark and Fran find rows of containment cells holding dozens of trapped specters, some intact, many broken open, explaining how an accident must have released a number of them, overwhelming the scientists' ability to control the situation. Nearby, They find a machine with an emergency shutdown system, but the instructions are dense with technical jargon, so Fran needs time to translate before they can act. Outside, the fight is deteriorating as the newer Spectres can reassemble themselves after being hit, and the weapons, while effective, aren't fast enough to keep up. Soldiers start falling as the creatures push forward. Back in the lab, Fran finally cracks the shutdown procedure, unlock all the ports, then pull a bracket to release the cables, and the system should shut everything down and destroy the Spectres at once. Mark climbs onto the machine to work the cables while Fran covers him, firing at Spectres breaking free from their cells and charging him. Outside, the Spectres' combined energy begins swirling into a violent vortex, pushing the soldiers back and threatening to overrun them. As one soldier fires directly into the center of the storm, Mark simultaneously yanks the cables loose and pulls the bracket free. The system erupts in a massive shockwave, throwing Mark off the machine and sending soldiers outside flying across the platform. Then the Spectres start disintegrating one by one, their transparent bodies breaking apart. As they vanish, the soldiers notice the agony on their ghostly faces, as though these things had been suffering the entire time. Fran checks on Mark after the blast, and they find themselves on a lower floor of the facility. A strange sound leads them to a hidden room, where they discover something even worse than the Spectres: capsules containing the brains and peripheral nervous systems of real people. The scientists hadn't just been scanning bodies to build the Spectres, they'd been using living human nervous systems to generate and control them. The people in the capsules aren't fully dead, but they aren't truly alive either, and Mark can tell they're still suffering. Without hesitation, he begins disconnecting them from the machines, ending their pain. Fran tries to stop him, urging him to think about the bigger picture, but Mark tells her this is the bigger picture. After everything he's seen, leaving them trapped like that would only prolong the horror that created the Spectres in the first place. With the threat eliminated, the military sends in rescue teams to recover survivors and relocate them to a new base. For a moment, it seems like the nightmare is over, but just days later, soldiers are preparing to head back out at this time to retrieve the machines from the power plant so the government can study and reverse engineer the technology. Before leaving Moldova, Mark says his goodbyes to Orland, and Fran, sorry, comes to see him off as well, thanking him in English for everything he did. Mark boards a plane back to the United States, leaving behind a battlefield where science, war, and death had collided into something far worse than anyone could have anticipated. The film opens in the middle of a war-ravaged Moldova, and that setting alone does a lot of the early heavy lifting. You're dropped into a battered city full of empty streets and half-collapsed buildings, where American forces are already tangled in a conflict bigger than anything they were prepared for. At first glance, it looks like standard war movie territory: soldiers moving through hostile ground, tense command briefings, armored vehicles, gunfire, smoke, wrecked streets, and the usual machinery. You might assume you know what kind of film this is going to be, maybe a gritty special forces survival story or an action thriller. Then the hook lands. These soldiers aren't just fighting insurgents, they're seeing something else on the battlefield. Or rather, they're not seeing it with their own eyes. Through hyperspectral goggles, strange humanoid shapes appear, moving like ghosts, slipping through the battlefield like something that shouldn't exist. When one of them makes contact with a person, that person is gone almost instantly. That's where Spectral gets genuinely interesting, because this threat doesn't arrive like a conventional enemy. There's no face, no uniform, no dialogue, no obvious motive, just a fast, silent, impossible presence cutting through trained soldiers effortlessly. For a stretch, the film has a genuinely compelling mystery running. Are these things supernatural, the ghosts of war the locals believe in, some kind of camouflage tech, or an equipment glitch? Or is the military staring down something entirely new that nobody's prepared to explain? That uncertainty is probably the strongest part of the setup. How the film understands that an enemy becomes scarier once the people carrying guns and wearing armor have absolutely no idea what they're up against. These aren't helpless civilians stumbling around in the dark, they're soldiers built to handle chaos, bullets, explosions, urban combat. This is different, And that contrast is what gives the premise its pull. There's something inherently tense about watching a modern military force run into a threat that renders all its hardware nearly useless. Guns don't solve it. Combat experience doesn't solve it. Even confidence starts to look foolish. One moment they're operating like consummate professionals. The next they're scrambling to survive something they can barely track. The Moldova setting also gives the story a rough, lived-in texture. This isn't a polished sci-fi world of gleaming corridors. It's broken roads, dust, smoke, and wreckage, with soldiers trying to make sense of the impossible in the middle of a very physical war. That blend of gritty military realism and ghostly science fiction is what gives Spectral its early identity. Is the setup wholly original? Not particularly. You can feel the influence of other military sci-fi films here. A squad enters hostile territory. The enemy proves far worse than expected. Survival becomes the only goal. We've seen that shape before, but the invisible threat angle gives it enough novelty to work, at least early on. It's a clean, simple hook. American troops trapped in a war zone, hunted by something that might not even be human. Exactly the kind of premise that makes you lean in, even if you suspect the film won't answer every question perfectly. And for a movie like this, that opening promise matters. Spectral doesn't set out to be a heavy political war drama or a character-driven military epic. It begins as a battlefield mystery wrapped in sci-fi tension. Soldiers are dying, the enemy can't be seen, and somewhere in all that smoke and panic, the film asks a deceptively simple question: what do you do when the battlefield itself feels haunted? Then the movie brings in Dr. Mark Clyne. And this is where Spectral shifts from pure battlefield chaos into something more investigative. Clyne isn't introduced as a loud action hero or a soldier out to prove himself. He's a DARPA scientist, the sort of person who looks at a war zone and thinks in terms of data rather than enemies or revenge, which gives the film a slightly different rhythm. The military has already captured something strange on the hyperspectral goggles, and the crucial detail is that Clyne helped design that very technology. So when the footage shows an impossible human-shaped figure killing a soldier, the army doesn't just need another fighter ray, they need the person who understands the machine that captured the image. Someone who can ask, is this real? A malfunction? Something the human eye simply can't process on its own? That's a smart way to fold him into the story. He isn't randomly dropped in because the plot needs a protagonist. His presence is tied directly to the mystery. He built the goggles. The anomaly shows up through them, and suddenly his scientific work has become part of a battlefield nightmare. What's notable about the setup is that Clyne arrives with real hesitation. He's uneasy seeing his invention deployed in war, and there's already a sense that he's uncomfortable watching scientific ideas get repurposed as weapons. That small moral edge makes him more compelling than the standard smart guy who explains things archetype. Once he's in Moldova, everyone around him wants answers for different reasons. The soldiers want to know how to survive. Command wants something actionable. Fran Madison has her own camouflage theory. The locals lean toward ghosts. And Clyne, caught in the middle of all that pressure, refuses to accept the easiest explanation. That works because it gives him a clear function. He's the one voice insisting they don't have enough information yet. Everyone else is reacting emotionally or tactically. Clyne is trying to slow the panic and convert fear into evidence, which makes him stand out in a film full of soldiers and explosions. He's not the biggest presence in the room, not the one carrying the heaviest weapon or barking orders, but the film quietly establishes that his mind matters more than firepower. The soldiers can shoot all day, but if nobody understands the target, they're just burning ammunition. James Badgedale fits the role well. He doesn't overplay Clyne as a flashy movie genius type. Instead he brings a grounded, practical energy, someone who clearly builds and studies systems and gets visibly frustrated when people leap to conclusions before gathering proof. That gives the film one of its better contrasts: military instinct versus scientific patience. Soldiers are trained to identify a target and eliminate it. Clyne is trained to question whether they even understand what the target is. That tension could have driven more conflict than the film ultimately explores, but early on it lends the story real texture. There's also something satisfying about watching a non-combatant get steadily pulled deeper into a combat situation. Clyne starts out examining footage from a safe distance, but the film quickly pushes him toward danger. He joins the mission, brings his equipment, tries to capture clearer images, and ends up standing beside soldiers being hunted by something invisible. That's where his role crystallizes. He becomes the bridge between the science fiction concept and the military survival story. Without him, Spectral would just be soldiers firing at ghosts. With him, the film has a reason to investigate, experiment, adapt, and eventually fight back. Does the film later stretch his abilities too far? Absolutely. There are moments where Clyne goes from capable engineer to battlefield miracle worker, and it can tip into silliness, but at the outset, his introduction works. He gives the audience a human way into the mystery. The man who built the eyes that saw the impossible, now standing in a ruined city trying to determine whether those eyes captured a glitch, a weapon, or something far worse. The real hook of Spectral isn't the war itself, and it isn't even the soldiers. It's those strange figures moving through the battlefield somewhere between science fiction and ghost story. For a stretch, that mystery is easily the most compelling thing the film has going for it. The soldiers aren't facing a conventional enemy, and no hidden sniper, no drone strike, no better armed unit. They're up against humanoid shapes visible only through specialized imaging gear. To the naked eye, there's essentially nothing there, just fear, confusion, and then someone suddenly dead. That's a strong idea because it strips the confidence right out of the military setup. These are people trained to respond to danger, but how do you respond to something you can't properly see, aim at, or even describe without sounding ridiculous? The film plays with that uncertainty early. One person suspects a glitch, another leans toward enemy camouflage. The locals believe the dead have returned, and honestly, given how these things move, it's easy to understand why people reach for supernatural explanations. They don't behave like soldiers. They move with an eerie, unnatural speed, and on contact, the victim isn't just injured, they're finished. That kind of threat gives the film a genuinely creepy edge even while it's functioning as a loud military action thriller. There's something unsettling about an enemy that doesn't shout, doesn't negotiate, shows no pain, and seems indifferent to the rules of the physical world. It's not a monster with teeth or a creature lurking in shadow. It's more like a lethal shape, a blur of energy, a figure that shouldn't be there. That's where the title starts to feel earned. These beings are spectral not just in appearance, but because they turn the battlefield into a space where technology and superstition collide. The goggles show something real, yet what they show looks impossible. The soldiers trust their equipment, but the image on it feels like a nightmare. This is probably where Spectral has its best shot at pulling viewers in a simple, sustained question. What are these things? Not just how do we kill them, but what are we even looking at? That matters because every possible answer reshapes the movie. Ghosts, and it's supernatural horror, camouflaged soldiers, and it's a military conspiracy, an experiment, and it becomes science fiction with a darker, human-made edge. The fun lies in that uncertainty. The film doesn't always protect the mystery as carefully as it could. Some viewers may feel it reveals too much too soon, and that's a fair complaint. Once you get a clear look at the threat, some of the unknown drains away. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the ghost on screen, but the possibility of what it might be before the film explains it. Still, the core concept holds up. The spectral beings are fast, silent, and almost absurdly powerful. Conventional weapons don't touch them, which makes every encounter feel lopsided. The military brings training, equipment, vehicles, and discipline, and none of it counts for much against an enemy that can simply move through soldiers and leave bodies in its wake. That's a strong foundation for tension, because once the team realizes they're facing something they fundamentally don't understand, the entire mood shifts. The mission stops being about winning and becomes about surviving long enough to learn the rules. Every good sci-fi threat needs rules. What can it do? What stops it? Why does it exist? Where did it come from? And Spectral builds its early momentum around exactly those questions. The film may not answer all of them perfectly later on, but early on, The mystery is enough to hold your attention and give the action real stakes. Every attack isn't just another explosion, it's another clue that the soldiers are up against something beyond their usual battlefield logic. That's why the spectral beings are the film's strongest opening idea. They're not deep characters, not emotional villains, not even fully understood at first. They're a question moving through smoke. And for a movie like this, that's a genuinely effective way to begin. One of the more interesting things Spectral does early on is show how each group filters the same impossible threat through its own worldview. That sounds simple, but it gives the setup more texture than a straightforward "here are ghost soldiers, now start shooting." The locals see spirits, and inside a war zone surrounded by death, ruined buildings, and missing families, that reaction makes intuitive sense. It's a fear rooted in the place itself, filtered through trauma and rumor rather than science. The military side is more practical. If something is killing their men, it must be an enemy, whether that's advanced camouflage or a new weapon from the opposing side. Their instinct isn't to wonder about the supernatural, it's to identify, understand, and destroy the threat. Fran Madison occupies similar territory as CIA. She naturally thinks in terms of hidden operations and enemy capabilities rather than ghost stories. And then there's Clyne, who refuses to let fear pick the answer prematurely. He doesn't fully buy the ghost theory, but he doesn't blindly accept the camouflage theory either. His position is essentially we don't have enough data, which matters because in a film full of people reacting fast, he's the one person trying to slow the room down. That contrast is one of the stronger elements of the premise. A technician looks at strange footage and assumes a glitch. A soldier looks at the same image and sees an enemy. Locals see spirits. Madison sees a possible tactic. Clyne sees an open question still awaiting proof. It's a very human detail. People constantly interpret the unknown through the lens of what they already believe, fear, or have been trained to notice. Spectral doesn't turn this into a deep philosophical debate, but the seed is there, and it keeps the mystery from feeling flat. The film could have pushed these competing interpretations further, soldiers growing more superstitious as attacks intensify, Madison's theory slowly collapsing, Clyne's insistence on evidence starting to frustrate people while more lives are lost. There's room for sharper drama there, but even in the version we get, the core idea works because the threat is frightening not only because it kills, but because nobody can agree on what it even is. That disagreement creates real pressure. If it's a weapon, maybe it can be disabled. If it's a creature, maybe it has weaknesses. If it's a ghost, everything the soldiers know becomes irrelevant. If it's a glitch, the army might be chasing shadows while the real danger lies elsewhere. Every theory opens a different film. And for a while Spectral lets all those possibilities hang in the air, which is when it feels most alive, before the science gets heavy and the explanations arrive. The best version of this movie exists in that uneasy space where technology, superstition, and military logic are all racing to explain the same nightmare. And that's exactly why Clyne's caution matters. He's not just the smart guy in the room, he's the reminder that the first explanation isn't always the right one. And in a war zone, that kind of patience is almost unnatural. Everyone wants an immediate answer because an answer feels like control, but control evaporates the moment these beings show up. So the film's early tension comes down to a simple dynamic. Everyone's staring at the same impossible image, but nobody's really seeing the same thing. What makes Spectral a bit frustrating is that the central idea is genuinely strong. You've got a war zone, elite soldiers, a scientist pulled into the field because his own invention captured something impossible, and ghost-like figures cutting people down in seconds while nobody can agree on whether they're supernatural, technological, or something stranger still. That's a compelling hook, the kind that should elevate the film above the average military sci-fi entry. There's a built-in mystery, real danger, a clean visual concept, and genuine tension in soldiers fighting an enemy they can't see that behaves like a weapon. The problem is that once you get past the hook, the underlying structure is very familiar. At its core, Spectral is a survival mission. A special forces team enters hostile territory, things go wrong. The enemy proves far more dangerous than expected, and the group has to fight, flee, regroup, and find a way to fight back. That structure isn't inherently bad. It keeps the story moving and gives audiences an easy path to follow, but it also means the film starts feeling predictable sooner than it should. You can practically sense the beats lining up. Soldiers distrust the civilian scientist, the mission deteriorates, the enemy overwhelms them, the team retreats, Clyne studies the threat, a solution emerges, and the film builds toward a bigger final confrontation. None of it is terrible. It gives the film momentum, but for a concept this cool, you want the story to surprise you more. The invisible enemy idea feels fresh enough that the film could have leaned harder into mystery, paranoia, or psychological dread. Instead, it often settles for a more conventional action rhythm. Here's the threat, here's the escape, here's the explanation, here's the counterattack. It's clean. Maybe too clean, which makes the film easier to watch but also easier to forget. That's the strange balance running through Spectral. It's never boring in the way a lifeless film is boring. There's plenty happening, the effects hold up, and the premise keeps you engaged for a while, but the story itself rarely opens new doors. It mostly takes a great idea and houses it inside a familiar military action shell. That's why some viewers will walk away satisfied while others feel let down. If you just want a slick sci-fi action film, the straightforwardness works in its favor, and no tangled plot, no dozen subplots to track, just a problem, people in danger, and forward momentum. There's real value in that for a casual watch, but if you're hoping the concept grows into something richer, the film feels like it leaves a lot on the table. There's a bigger movie hiding inside Spectral, one with stronger world building, sharper character drama, more room for the mystery to breathe, and a deeper sense of what these beings represent. The ingredients are all there. The film just doesn't let them simmer long enough. Instead, it delivers something solid, simple, and direct. American forces trapped in a devastated city, hunted by a strange enemy, with a scientist racing to understand the threat before everyone dies. That's the film in its cleanest form. And it's enough to make it watchable, but it's also why Spectral never quite becomes great. The concept has more teeth than the plot built around it ultimately allows. Maybe that's why the film works best once you stop expecting it to reinvent anything. It's not aiming to be a deep sci-fi masterpiece. It's a straightforward military survival thriller built around one genuinely cool, supernatural-looking hook. Depending on your mood, that might be exactly enough. Spectral is one of those films where you can almost feel the trade-off happening in real time. Visually, it knows how to sell itself. The ruined city looks harsh and grimy, soldiers push through smoke and broken concrete, the weapons feel weighty, the explosions land hard, and the spectral beings have a slick, ghostly digital look that makes the film feel bigger than you'd expect from something that landed on Netflix. For a while, that surface is enough. There's real pleasure in watching a film that understands the power of a strong image, a squad pushing through a wrecked street, strange shapes materializing through military goggles, gunfire lighting up an industrial space, armored vehicles rolling into an already doomed battlefield. Spectral doesn't always make total sense, but it knows how to look like a serious sci-fi action film. That's probably why it works best when you're not asking too many questions. Because the moment you start pulling at the story, things get shaky. The plot is simple, sometimes too simple, and the internal logic bends whenever the action demands it. The science sounds impressive in the moment but doesn't always feel fully earned, and characters often make decisions because the film needs them positioned for the next sequence rather than because those choices feel natural. Just as you start noticing the cracks, though, the film throws another loud, stylish set piece at you, and that's honestly part of its appeal. Spectral isn't built on airtight storytelling or deep emotional writing. It's built on momentum, visuals, and the basic thrill of watching soldiers face something incomprehensible. It wants you to lean back, accept the premise, and let the action carry you. If you do, there's genuine fun here. Not brilliant, not unforgettable, but solid, pulpy, late-night sci-fi entertainment. Style over substance fits almost too neatly, but that doesn't automatically make the film worthless. Some movies survive on atmosphere, some on a strong lead, some because the action is staged well enough to paper over weaker elements. Spectral lives in that space. It has just enough polish to keep you watching. The visuals carry weight. The script doesn't always provide. The sound design makes the threat feel more intense than the writing sometimes earns. The war-torn setting creates a mood more compelling than many of the characters moving through it. There are stretches where the film looks like it's hiding a much richer story than it actually has, and you can see the money on screen, the effort in the design. The filmmakers clearly trying to build something cinematic and harsh, but the writing doesn't always rise to meet that presentation. It's as if the movie is wearing the armor of a smarter film while underneath it remains a fairly conventional action ride. That doesn't sink it entirely for the right viewer. Spectral works precisely because it doesn't demand much. You're not sitting down expecting layered psychology or airtight political context. You're watching for the strange enemy, the slick effects, the battlefield chaos, and the simple question of how these people fight back. But if you need the story to hold together tightly, the film will test your patience. There are too many moments where spectacle papers over convenience, too many beats where the movie hopes the noise distracts you from asking how something happened so fast, or why a character can suddenly solve a problem that should be impossible. It keeps moving, and movement hides a lot. Still, there's a reason people keep cutting this film some slack. It has energy, scale, and a clean visual identity, and even when the story runs thin, the presentation keeps insisting you're watching something bigger and more intense than the script actually delivers. That's Spectral in a nutshell. Not a great story wrapped in average visuals, but more like an average story wrapped in surprisingly strong visuals, which, depending on what you want from a sci-fi action film, can read as either a disappointment or a perfectly satisfying way to spend an evening. This is where Spectral starts asking for a little too much generosity from the viewer. Taken purely as a loud sci-fi action film, it moves along well enough. Soldiers in danger, a cool-looking enemy, a battlefield that keeps the story pushing forward. But the moment you start thinking about the details, things begin to wobble, not collapse, just wobble. The story keeps throwing scientific explanations at the audience, and some of them sound compelling in the moment, packed with enough serious-sounding terminology around energy, imaging, and experimental physics that you might briefly think there's a real system underpinning it all. But the deeper it goes, the more that science feels like decoration rather than foundation, there to make the impossible sound slightly less impossible. The film wants the threat to feel grounded, but it also wants the freedom of a ghost story. So the specters behave like supernatural entities when the film wants horror, like advanced weapons when it wants action, and like a scientific puzzle whenever Clyne needs to solve something. That mixture can be fun, but it's rarely clean. Major revelations sometimes arrive so quickly they barely have time to land, and the film tends to tell us important things after the fact rather than letting us feel the discovery unfold, rushing into the next action beat instead of building toward it properly. There's also the logic of survival to consider. These beings are presented as brutally fast, nearly unstoppable, and essentially immune to conventional weapons. They tear through trained soldiers effortlessly. So when certain characters keep surviving situations that wipe out everyone around them, it starts to feel convenient. You understand why the plot needs them alive, but when the enemy is this powerful, every survival has to be handled carefully, or the tension flips from that was intense to wait, how did they not die there? Spectral has a few of those moments. The technology follows a similar pattern. The hyperspectral goggles are a great idea and the engine of the mystery. But the film leans on gadgets and breakthroughs in ways that feel a little too convenient. The right device shows up at the right time, a theory arrives exactly when the plot needs it, a solution appears because the story has reached the point where one must exist. A sci-fi film doesn't need to be scientifically airtight. That would probably make it unbearable. But even fictional science benefits from consistent rules and a believable sense of cause and effect. Spectral sometimes has rules, and sometimes it has vibes, and honestly, the vibes work better than the rules. The film is far more convincing showing soldiers panicking in a ruined street than explaining precisely why these beings function the way they do. The visuals sell the danger, the sound sells the impact, The atmosphere sells the fear, and the explanations are the part that gets slippery. There's also the usual shorthand, compressed timelines, discoveries that come too easily, complex scientific conclusions accepted with surprising speed in the middle of a collapsing war zone. Entertaining, sure, but not always believable. That's really the core issue. Spectral wants to be taken seriously enough to use scientific language, military procedure, and a gritty war setting, but it also wants the freedom to bend logic whenever the action calls for something bigger. Those two instincts keep working against each other. Leaning fully into pulpy nonsense might have made the weak logic less noticeable. Leaning harder into grounded science fiction might have made the explanations land better. Instead, the film sits in the middle, and that middle ground is exactly where the cracks show most clearly. Still, for a lot of viewers this won't be a deal breaker. This is the kind of film where you can dial down the critical part of your brain, accept that the science is more dramatic than rigorous, and enjoy the ride. Do that, and there's still enough action and atmosphere to stay engaged. But if you need a story with no loose threads, Spectral will make you pause more than once. Beneath the smoke, gunfire, and ghostly visuals is a script that keeps asking you not to look too closely, and the closer you look, the more the film feels held together by momentum rather than logic. Then there's one of the most talked about elements, Clyne's transformation into a battlefield MacGyver. To be fair, the film sets him up as genuinely sharp and practical, not a lab guy who panics under fire, but someone who understands systems and can see what a piece of technology could become, not just what it was built for. That's actually one of his stronger traits. The problem is the film pushes it so far it becomes hard not to smile, sometimes not in the way it intends. Once Clyne grasps the nature of the threat, the movie shifts into full invention mode, not simple fixes or rough field patches, but advanced countermeasures, upgraded gear, and battlefield-ready weapons assembled under impossible pressure out of whatever happens to be lying around. In a pulpy sci-fi action film that can work, there's satisfaction in watching characters stop running and start fighting back, and after so much time watching soldiers get destroyed by an untouchable enemy, there's a natural thrill in seeing them build something that finally gives them a chance. The montage energy is there, people scrambling, sparks flying, gear coming together, everyone suddenly purposeful again. The film wants you to feel that shift from helplessness to resistance. But it's also very convenient, because Clyne doesn't just think quickly, he essentially rewrites battlefield engineering in a matter of hours. The film asks us to believe that, in a dusty bunker with limited time and scavenged parts, he can help assemble an arsenal capable of handling a threat nobody understood a day earlier. That's a big ask, and it's where the film's just go with it quality becomes hardest to ignore. If you're enjoying the ride, you might accept it as part of the fun. The scientist finds the weakness, the soldiers upgrade their gear, and the final battle can proceed. Simple and entertaining, but if you're tracking the logic, it starts to feel a little ridiculous fast. The film treats engineering like movie magic, hand Clyne some scrap, a bit of military hardware, a few serious looks, and half an hour, and the problem is solved. Need more weapons? No issue. Build a whole set. Need the team ready for the final assault? Cue the montage. That's where some tension drains away, because the enemy is originally terrifying precisely because the soldiers have no defense. Their weapons and training simply don't matter. Once Clyne starts solving everything this quickly, the threat feels less like an incomprehensible force and more like a technical problem waiting for the right gadget, and that shifts the film's flavor. Early Spectral feels like horror crossed with military sci-fi. Later Spectral starts feeling more like a video game upgrade sequence. The team levels up, unlocks better gear, and heads toward the boss fight. That's not automatically bad, but it does make the story feel more mechanical. Still, it's easy to see why some viewers enjoy it. There's a simple pleasure in watching intelligence beat brute force. The soldiers can't shoot their way out of the problem, so Clyne's mind becomes the weapon. He studies, adapts, improvises, and gives them a fighting chance, which fits the film's science versus chaos theme reasonably well. The execution, though, is just too tidy. A bit more trial and error, Clyne failing occasionally, or the weapons coming out unstable, dangerous, or barely functional might have made it land better. Instead, the solutions arrive with the smoothness of a film that knows it has a big finale to reach and doesn't want to slow down. So the MacGyver material is both entertaining and a little silly at once. It powers the film forward, but it also exposes how thin the underlying logic can be. It makes Clyne look brilliant, occasionally too brilliant, and creates a satisfying comeback moment at the cost of making everything feel a bit too easy. That's Spectral all over. A cool idea, a slick presentation, a scene that works emotionally because you want the heroes to finally fight back, while a small voice in the back of your head keeps asking, wait, they built all that from that? Whatever problems the story has, and whatever holes you can poke in the science or logic, the film understands one very basic thing: people came to watch soldiers thrown into an impossible fight, and on that front it delivers. The combat is loud, chaotic, and thoroughly modern military sci-fi in flavor. Armored vehicles pushing through broken streets, soldiers shouting over gunfire, weapons lighting up dark spaces, explosions ripping through the war zone, and a constant sense that the team is being pushed deeper into a situation they were never properly briefed for. It's not graceful action, it's messy, smoky, and aggressive, which suits the film well. The strongest action sequences work because the soldiers aren't just fighting a tougher enemy, they're fighting something that renders their combat instincts nearly useless. These are trained operators used to clearing rooms, watching corners, trusting their gear, but against an enemy that rushes through the battlefield like a ghost and drops people instantly, all of that starts to look frighteningly small. That's where the film finds its energy. The gunfights aren't compelling because the soldiers might outshoot the Spectres. Clearly they can't, at least not early on. The tension comes from watching them process the shock of that realization. They fire because it's what they know how to do, but the bullets don't solve anything. The enemy keeps coming, the team keeps losing ground, and the mission keeps collapsing. There's real effectiveness in the dynamic. Spectral is full of familiar military action ingredients, but the invisible threat angle gives those sequences a distinct edge. A normal firefight has a rhythm. You know roughly where the danger is, who's pinned down, who needs cover. Here, danger feels unstable. It can strike from almost anywhere, and sometimes the characters only understand what happened after someone's already dead. That keeps the early battles from feeling routine. The war-torn setting also amplifies the action that doesn't unfold in bright, polished environments but in ruined streets, damaged buildings, industrial spaces, and bunker-like rooms that feel heavy and unstable, adding pressure by suggesting escape routes could vanish and any corner might become a trap. Is the action unforgettable? Not always. Some sequences are more functional than memorable, and the film doesn't always land those one or two signature moments that stick with you afterward. A lot of the combat blurs together into gunfire, running, explosions, regrouping, more gunfire, but in the moment, it works, and for a film like this, that's what counts. Spectral isn't chasing quiet, slow burn drama. It wants to keep you engaged through pressure and escalation, and when the soldiers are pinned down or forced to retreat, the pulse is strong. You feel the panic rising because everyone is armed, everyone is trained, and still nobody seems adequately prepared. That's the action's best trick. It makes firepower feel inadequate. Most military action films treat more weapons as more control. Bigger guns, better gear, bigger vehicles, and the heroes push back. Here, the early combat flips that expectation. The equipment looks impressive, the soldiers look capable, and the enemy still tears through them, creating a helplessness that gives the action more tension than a standard insurgent shootout would. The film's slightly video game rhythm: missions, objectives, retreats, gear upgrades, escalating confrontations isn't entirely a knock against it either. Sometimes it plays like watching a squad advance from one level to the next, surviving long enough to unlock the next piece of information, which can make the storytelling feel mechanical but also gives the action a simple, forward drive. You always know the immediate objective: get out of the street, reach shelter, survive the attack, understand the enemy, find a way to fight back. The film rarely gets complicated, and that directness helps the pace. You're not juggling 10 emotional subplots, You're watching people try not to die, and when Spectral leans into that, it works. Not brilliant, not groundbreaking, but solid. There's real appeal in watching heavily armed soldiers slowly realize they're no longer the most dangerous thing in the room, and that idea drives the combat's tension. The film may be built from cliché tilde copyright-esque, but the battlefield threat is strong enough to keep the action moving. So yes, the action scenes carry a lot of the film. They cover for weaker writing, distract from the shakier science, and give the production its scale and energy. Even when characters are thin, the situation itself carries enough urgency to keep you watching. Spectral is at its best when it stops trying to sound smarter than it is and simply lets the chaos take over. Soldiers in a ruined city, weapons that don't work, a ghost-like enemy moving too fast to comprehend. Not deep cinema, but for a military sci-fi ride, it gets the job done. The strongest tension in Spectral comes from a simple idea. What happens when people trained to handle danger meet something they genuinely cannot handle? That's the film's best pulse. These soldiers aren't amateurs stumbling through bad decisions like in a horror movie. They're armed, organized, and accustomed to hostile environments, trained to react under pressure, clear buildings, cover each other, and push through fear because their job demands it. But the Spectres don't care about any of that, which is exactly what makes them effective. At first the soldiers treat this like a new kind of enemy force, maybe advanced camouflage, maybe an unfamiliar weapon, something they can adjust tactics to counter. But the film makes clear fairly quickly that this isn't a normal battlefield disadvantage, it's something worse. Guns don't stop it, armor doesn't protect against it, confidence doesn't survive contact with it. There's a specific kind of dread in watching capable people become helpless. And that's why the early attacks hit harder than they probably should. The film doesn't need dense character writing in those moments because the situation itself carries the weight. As soldier sees something through the goggles, someone fires, the shape keeps advancing, and the room or street collapses into panic. In most war films, danger still follows physical logic. Bullets travel, explosions have range, enemies can be shot, pinned, outmaneuvered. Even when things go badly, strategy still matters. But here, the threat slips past all of that. It moves too fast, appears where it shouldn't, makes contact, and that's essentially the end. Every encounter feels unfair, and sometimes unfair is exactly what a film like this needs. The best moments in Spectral aren't when the heroes look powerful, they're when the soldiers realize power isn't enough. All that equipment, training, and military confidence suddenly feels fragile. You can have the armored vehicles, the rifles, the tactical gear, the entire serious war machine look, and still be completely outmatched by something you barely understand. That's a solid reversal and turns the military setup into a genuine survival scenario, where the mission stops being about defeating an enemy and becomes about escaping long enough to figure out what the enemy even is. Once that shift happens, the film becomes far more engaging. The soldiers stop controlling the battlefield, and the battlefield starts controlling them. There's also a nice horror flavor to how the Spectres attack. They're not loud in the typical monster movie sense. They don't taunt, don't roar for the camera. They simply arrive, move through the space, and leave destruction in their wake. That quiet, almost emotionless quality makes them feel less like villains and more like a force, a storm wearing a human shape. And a force is harder to reason with than a person. You can't intimidate it, negotiate with it, or scare it off. You either learn its weakness or you run, and that instinct to run is where the real tension kicks in. Spectral gets more exciting once the characters stop pretending they can win every fight. There's something satisfying about a film letting its soldiers retreat, panic, regroup, and admit they aren't ready. It gives the danger real weight and keeps the Spectres from feeling like just another target waiting to be dispatched in the next scene. For a while, they feel almost unbeatable, which matters because the threat needs to feel larger than the humans facing it. If the Spectres were just another type of enemy combatant, the film would grow ordinary fast. But because they seem to break the rules of combat entirely, they lend the story a distinct kind of pressure. Every step forward carries risk. Every dark corner matters, every delay could cost a life. The film eventually has to find a way to fight back, Of course that's simply the shape of this kind of story, and the heroes can spend the entire runtime running. But before the solutions and explanations arrive, Spectral has a solid stretch where the enemy feels genuinely overwhelming, and that's the version of the film that works best. A squad of trained soldiers stripped of control, a scientist racing to understand something faster than people are dying, a battlefield where the normal rules no longer apply. The film doesn't always earn every twist or explanation, but when it leans into the terror of an enemy that can't be stopped through ordinary means, the tension feels clean and direct. Not because the characters are richly written or the politics are complex, but because the situation taps into a very basic fear. Being fully prepared for war and still completely unprepared for what actually shows up. Whatever else you might say about Spectral, one thing's hard to deny: the film looks and sounds bigger than you'd expect. That's probably the biggest surprise. This isn't one of those streaming sci-fi films where everything feels cheap the moment the action kicks, and Spectral has genuine weight on screen. The environments feel damaged, the military gear feels convincing, and the spectral beings carry enough visual polish to make the threat feel like it belongs in a far more expensive production. The money is clearly there, if not always in the script. The CGI is easily one of the film's strongest assets. The spectral beings have that unsettling ghost energy design, human enough to be disturbing, unnatural enough to feel wrong. They're not just transparent people drifting around, they have movement, speed, texture, a kind of cold digital presence that sells the idea that the soldiers are facing something outside normal combat. When they attack, the effects generally do their job. The impact is quick, harsh, and visually clear enough that you understand the soldiers' terror. These things don't just injure people, they erase confidence from the scene entirely. One touch, one rush forward, and a trained fighter is gone, and the effects communicate that without needing lengthy exposition. The sound design pulls even more weight. This is a film meant to be felt through speakers. The gunfire has real punch, the explosions carry force, the machinery and battlefield noise build a constant sense of pressure, and the spectral threat cuts through all of it with its own eerie audio signature. The film understands how to make the invisible feel present, which matters given how much of the threat depends on something the characters can't properly see. That combination of heavy military sound and unsettling sci-fi audio gives the action more impact than the writing alone could deliver. There are moments where the story doesn't fully convince you, but the sound and visuals nearly bully you into staying engaged. A scene starts drifting into silliness, then something explodes, the screen fills with smoke and energy, the subwoofer kicks in, and you're pulled back in, not because the plot suddenly got smarter, but because the film still knows how to deliver a strong sensory experience. That matters for this kind of movie. Spectral isn't aiming for quiet, subtle science fiction, it's built like a combat tride, the camera weaving through broken urban spaces while the enemy carries a slick, glowing, otherworldly quality that contrasts nicely with the grimy physical world around it. That contrast is probably the source of the film's visual appeal. The setting is gritty, but the threat is almost clean in a strange way. Soldiers covered in dust, hauling heavy gear, moving through ruined streets, while these smooth, ghost-like figures made of cold energy and questionable science drift through the frame. The two visual languages clash productively and give the film its identity. Even the military hardware gets real attention. Armored vehicles, tactical gear, weapons, goggles, cameras, and improvised defenses all look more convincing than they strictly needed to. Nothing feels like a toy version of the military. The gear carries a slick, faintly futuristic edge while staying close enough to reality to keep the world grounded. That's a smart balance. Push the tech too far and the film loses its war zone grit. Keep it too ordinary and the sci-fi threat feels bolted on. Spectral finds a middle ground where the soldiers still feel like modern operators while the surrounding technology hints at something just advanced enough to belong in a near-future thriller. That production value also papers over the film's rougher patches. When characters feel thin, the effects keep scenes alive. When dialogue gets stiff, the atmosphere carries some of the load. When the science sounds shaky, the design makes it easier to accept. The film often survives on the strength of its surface exceeding its foundation. which isn't always a compliment but is still a real accomplishment. Plenty of movies with bigger ambitions look cheaper than this. Spectral's story may be routine, but it rarely looks careless. There's genuine craft in how the world is built. The ruined city has real scale, the action has real impact, and while the digital effects aren't flawless in every shot, they're strong enough to sustain the illusion most of the time. You'll notice a few rough edges as some vehicle and large-scale action moments don't move quite naturally, and a handful of digital shots carry a slightly weightless quality that gives the game away. But compared to the average lower-budget sci-fi action film, Spectral holds up better than expected. It has that "why didn't this get more attention" quality, and it's easy to understand why some viewers were surprised it didn't land a bigger release. Whatever happened behind the scenes, the finished film doesn't look like something assembled without confidence. It looks like a genuine attempt at a cinematic military sci-fi thriller with enough polish to make its world feel dangerous and large. That's why the effects aren't just decoration, they're central to whether the film works at all. The spectral beings need to look convincing or the whole premise collapses. The battlefield needs to feel intense or the survival story loses its pressure. The sound needs to hit hard or the action goes flat. In all three areas, the film performs better than its script sometimes deserves. So while Spectral isn't the sharpest sci-fi film around, it's absolutely one of those movies where the technical craftsmanship keeps dragging it back from the edge. The story stumbles, the logic bends, the characters could use more depth, but the visuals, the CGI, the sound, and the overall production value keep insisting, stay with it. For a lot of viewers, that will be enough. One thing Spectral gets right almost immediately is a strong sense of place. The film drops us into a ruined city that already looks exhausted before the ghostly threat even shows up. Broken streets, damaged buildings, smoke hanging over everything, the whole environment carrying that gray, heavy look of a battlefield that's been chewed up for far too long. It doesn't feel clean or safe, it feels like somewhere bad has already happened, with something worse now moving through it. That atmosphere does a lot of work for the film, because with a fairly simple story, the surrounding world has to compensate, and to its credit, Spectral builds a war zone that feels genuinely physical, and you can almost feel the dust, the cold concrete, the rubble underfoot. It gives the film texture even when the writing isn't especially deep, making the situation feel more serious than it might read on paper. The visual design is also smart in how it keeps the sci-fi element grounded within a rough military environment. This isn't shiny spaceship science fiction. There are no pristine white rooms or gleaming futuristic cities, just destroyed streets, abandoned industrial spaces, damaged facilities, and grim urban corners that all feel like they could collapse or become a trap. That backdrop makes the spectral beings feel even stranger. Smooth, ghost-like shapes drifting through a world of broken concrete and military hardware. The contrast works. The city is dirty and realistic while the threat feels unnatural, almost impossible, as though it slipped in from a nightmare. One belongs to war, the other doesn't belong anywhere. Together they give the film its strongest visual identity, and without that setting, Spectral would lose a substantial amount of its power. The ruined Moldova backdrop gives the film scale. You're not just watching people run through random hallways, you feel like they're trapped inside a much larger conflict, even if the film doesn't dig deeply into that conflict itself. Tanks, armored vehicles, checkpoints, destroyed buildings, soldiers moving through territory that's clearly been fought over again and again. The film understands that a good war zone isn't just a place where action happens, it's a mood. It signals that order has already failed, that people have already suffered, that nobody fully controls the space anymore. Once the invisible enemy enters that environment, the city starts to feel almost cursed. Dangerous not just because of bullets and bombs, but because nobody knows what's hiding in the smoke. That gritty design is a real asset to the tension. A clean location would make the specters too easy to read, but in a city full of dust, fire, debris, and shadow, the threat becomes genuinely harder to parse. The soldiers already contend with limited visibility and broken spaces from the fighting alone. Add a nearly invisible enemy, and the entire environment becomes part of the fear. There's also real weight to the military visuals, and the armored vehicles look solid. The weapons don't feel like cheap props. The gear has a slick tactical edge without tipping into cartoonishness. You believe these people are part of a serious operation even as the story starts making questionable choices, and that attention to detail makes the film feel more expensive than it probably had any right to. The hardware, the smoky streets, the industrial locations, the bunkers, the command spaces, all of it gives Spectral a grounded surface. The film may be dealing with energy-based ghost soldiers, but it consistently places them inside heavy, practical locations, and that balance is one of the reasons the film stays watchable even when the plot gets shaky. The atmosphere is doing more work than the characters at times, which is both a compliment and a criticism. If the characters carried as much texture as the locations, this would be a considerably stronger film. The city feels worn down, the military world feels lived in, the abandoned buildings carry a sense of history. Many of the people moving through those spaces, by comparison, feel thinner, the setting has scars, while the characters often just have jobs. Still, when the camera moves through that wrecked urban landscape, the film has real presence. You sense a place where war has already stripped away normal life, and now science fiction has arrived to make things worse. That's a strong visual idea, giving the film a grim personality and separating it from cheaper sci-fi action movies that look like they were shot in empty warehouses with a few added sparks. Spectral may not feel especially original in its story, but visually it has enough atmosphere to hold attention. At the smoke, the debris, the ruined city, the industrial decay, the military convoys pushing through hostile streets all combine to make the film feel bigger and harsher than its basic plot, creating a world where the invisible threat feels almost believable, not because the science is airtight but because the environment already feels like a place where reality itself has been badly damaged. That's why the war zone design matters so much. It's not just background, it's the film's mood, its texture, and, at times, its strongest character. The pacing in Spectral is a strange thing. The film is never fully dead, but it never quite moves as smoothly as it should either. There are stretches with real confidence. Once the soldiers are out in the city and the threat starts closing in, the film has a clean forward push, people running, regrouping, trying to process what just happened, the danger constantly forcing them into the next situation. In those moments, the film feels alive, carrying that keep moving or die energy that suits this kind of military sci-fi thriller well. Then the rhythm starts to wobble. The opening, for instance, doesn't land for everyone. The film spends time establishing the conflict, the military presence, the strange footage, and Clyne's arrival, but some of it feels like the movie circling the actual story before properly grabbing hold of it. The setup is understandable, but that first stretch doesn't always create the sharpest hook. It feels like the film is warming up when it should already be pulling you in. Then, almost suddenly, everything speeds up. The specters arrive, soldiers start dying, theories fly, and the film jumps from mystery into pure survival mode. That shift is exciting, but it also creates one of the film's core problems. Important information often arrives too quickly. Rather than letting discoveries build naturally, Spectral frequently rushes through them to get to the next chase, firefight, or technical breakthrough. That unevenness shows. When the action is running, the film usually has momentum. When characters stop to explain the science or discuss the threat, the energy dips. Not always, but often enough to notice. The film wants to be both a brainy sci-fi puzzle and a loud military action ride, but those two modes don't always move at the same speed. Action wants urgency, science needs room to breathe. Spectral typically chooses urgency, which keeps things entertaining but weakens the story's overall impact as some ideas get introduced, explained, and left behind before they can register as important. You sense the film has a lot it wants to tell you but worries that slowing down too much will lose the audience. So instead of fully developing certain moments, it just keeps pushing forward. That works in short bursts. A fast pace can disguise a lot, and if the visuals are strong and the danger feels immediate, you don't always pause to question every detail. Over time, though, the rushed storytelling creates a different issue. The film gives you events without always giving you the weight behind them. Major turns happen, characters react, the mission shifts, and you're occasionally left thinking, that needed more setup. The middle stretch is probably the strongest section, because by then the film has found its shape. The characters know something impossible is hunting them. They're trapped in hostile territory, and the goal is simple: survive long enough to understand it. That's where the pacing works best, because story and action are moving in the same direction. Later, once the film shifts into explanation and counterattack mode, the rhythm becomes more mechanical. It starts feeling less like an unfolding mystery and more like the film checking boxes on the way to the final battle. Understand the enemy, build the tools, prepare the team, launch the assault. It keeps moving, but the movement grows predictable, and that's where the final act suffers. Rather than tightening into a powerful conclusion, the film becomes more conventional. As the earlier mystery fades, the horror edge softens, and the movie leans harder into spectacle and quick fixes. Some viewers will appreciate the clear payoff, others may feel the film loses the mood that made the first half compelling. Both reactions make sense. Spectral isn't poorly paced in any obvious way. It's not simply slow start to finish, and it doesn't drag without incident. The issue is more specific. The film spends time in the wrong places and rushes through moments that likely needed more attention. It could have used a stronger opening, more room for the mystery to develop, and more space for the characters to process the horror instead of constantly being pushed toward the next objective. Oddly, it could have worked either shorter or longer, depending on what kind of film it wanted to be. Trimming some of the slower explanations might have suited a pure action approach, while a richer sci-fi war thriller would have needed more time for emotional closure, character arcs, and the moral weight of Clyne's technology. The film feels too long for its bare-bones plot but too short for the bigger ideas buried inside it, and that tension runs through the pacing from start to finish. Spectral has enough speed to entertain but not quite enough balance to fully satisfy. It rushes when it should settle, slows when the energy should stay tight, and reaches its ending with the sense that some pieces were skipped, compressed, or left undercooked. Still, momentum carries it through. Even when the rhythm falters, there's usually something pulling you forward: a threat, a question, a burst of action, a striking visual which is why the film stays watchable despite its pacing issues. But you can feel the better version underneath: a cleaner opening, a more carefully sustained mystery, smoother transitions between science and action, and a final stretch that feels earned rather than rushed. Spectral gets from point A to point B. It just clips a few walls along the way. The first half of Spectral has a much firmer grip on its own mystery than the back half does, and that's probably the biggest split in the film. Early on, there's a genuine sense of uncertainty as the soldiers are seeing shapes they can't explain, the footage looks impossible, and people keep floating theories that never feel fully reliable. The locals talk about spirits, Madison suspects enemy technology, Clyne keeps demanding data, and somewhere in the middle of all that, the film carries a pleasantly uneasy feeling, as though it could still become several different kinds of movie at once: a supernatural horror, military science fiction, a war thriller hiding an experiment underneath. That uncertainty gives the opening half its flavor. You're not just watching soldiers get attacked, you're watching everyone slowly realize the rules of the battlefield have changed and nobody has the manual yet. That's when Spectral feels most alive, and the threat is still strange. The specters are still frightening because they haven't yet been reduced to a technical explanation. They move like ghosts, kill like weapons, and generate panic because the characters can't slot them into a familiar category. The film is at its strongest while that question stays open: what exactly are these things? Then, as the story progresses, the mystery starts shrinking. That's not inherently a flaw. Every mystery eventually has to answer something, and the audience can't spend the whole runtime watching people flee glowing figures with zero explanation. But Spectral runs into a problem common to a lot of high-concept sci-fi: the question is more exciting than the answer. Once the film starts explaining the specters, the mood shifts. The eerie, haunted Warzone feeling gives way to a more straightforward action plan. The enemy stops being an incomprehensible presence and becomes a problem awaiting the right weapon. theory, and final assault. In other words, the film slowly pivots from what are we facing to how do we destroy it. That shift makes narrative sense, but it also makes the film more conventional. The first half has atmosphere, mystery, and a genuine fear of the unknown. The second half has more gear, more explanation, more preparation, and more familiar action beats. Clyne figures things out. The soldiers regroup, weapons get modified, the team gears up to fight back. It becomes less haunting and more mechanical. You can almost feel the film opting for safety, trading the strange space between ghost story and military thriller for a conventional final act where everything needs to be spelled out clearly enough for a big finish. The threat gets defined, the rules narrow, and the characters stop being overwhelmed by the unknown, shifting instead toward a solution. The final stretch still has action, still looks good, still delivers a sense of payoff, but it lacks the freshness of the early sections. That's the frustrating part. Spectral opens with a premise that feels like it could venture somewhere darker, stranger, even more psychological. A war zone haunted by invisible killers is a genuinely strong idea, and soldiers whose own technology reveals something beyond normal perception carries built-in tension, room for paranoia, dread, moral discomfort, even real emotional weight around what's being created and destroyed. But the film doesn't fully chase those possibilities. It settles into a cleaner structure: survive, investigate, explain, build, attack. Tidy, watchable, and also the point where the film starts feeling like a more generic sci-fi action product. The final act isn't bad, but it feels smaller than the mystery preceding it. That's often the risk with this type of story. The unknown is powerful because the audience fills in the gaps, and once the film hands you the answer, that answer has to be strong enough to replace every possibility you'd imagined. In Spectral, the explanation is interesting enough to keep things moving but not quite strong enough to make the mystery feel fully rewarded. Some viewers will be perfectly fine with that. They came for action, and the film delivers it. They wanted to see the soldiers fight back, and the film gives them that satisfaction too. There's real pleasure in watching helpless characters finally find their footing. But if the eerie uncertainty of the first half is what pulled you in, the final act might feel a little too ordinary by comparison. The film starts with soldiers confronting something nearly supernatural and ends with a fairly standard sci-fi assault, and somewhere between those two versions, a bit of the original magic slips away. That doesn't ruin Spectral, but it does define its ceiling. The film is never more compelling than when it withholds explanation. The less the characters understand, the more tension the film carries. The more it explains, the more it becomes just another action movie with a cool-looking enemy. So the first half sells the promise, and the final act delivers the product. A decent product, sure, but the promise was the more exciting version. As for the performances, Spectral isn't the kind of film where actors get sprawling emotional monologues or deeply layered character arcs. Nobody here is working with award material, but the cast does enough to keep the film standing, which matters for this type of sci-fi action thriller. Not every character needs to feel like a fully realized human being with a rich inner life. Sometimes the job is simply to sell the situation and keep the danger believable enough that the audience stays locked in. James Badge-Dale anchors the film as Dr. Mark Clyne, and it's a tricky role to balance. He's not a soldier, but he can't come across as useless either. He's not meant to be the loudest voice in the room, yet the story needs him to become the person everyone increasingly depends on. Dale plays him with grounded, practical energy, which helps a great deal. He doesn't lean into cartoonish genius, even when the script pushes Clyne towards ridiculous last-minute inventions. Dale keeps the character fairly serious, giving him the quality of someone constantly observing, processing, and trying to understand the machine behind the chaos. That's likely why Clyne works better than he probably should. On paper he could have easily become the standard smart guy, explains the plot archetype who walks in, delivers something complicated, and lets everyone stare blankly before the scene moves on. Dale gives him enough weight to feel like a person under real pressure rather than a walking exposition device. There's a quiet tension in his discomfort with how science is being weaponized around him. He's clearly not fully at home in the military world, surrounded by people who think in terms of action while he thinks in terms of evidence. The film could have dug into that contrast more, but Dale's performance keeps it noticeable even when the script doesn't dwell on it. Emily Mortimer's Fran Madison is a bit more complicated. She brings intelligence and composure to the role, and when the film uses her as part of the investigation, she fits well. Madison carries that CIA presence, never panicking, never buying into ghost stories, never fully trusting anyone's assumptions, and she feels like someone who genuinely belongs on the strategic side of the story. The issue is the film doesn't always know what to do with her once the action ramps up. Some viewers may feel her character gets pushed into combat situations without sufficient justification, and that's a fair red. There are moments where it feels like the writers wanted her in the scene simply because the group needed another recognizable face, not because the story had built a strong reason for her presence. Mortimer does what she can, elevating the role beyond what's on the page, but the writing doesn't always support her. Still, she works as a counterpoint to Clyne. He wants data. She wants a workable explanation that fits the conflict, and while their dynamic isn't deeply developed, it gives the film some structure beyond soldiers shouting and things exploding. The military supporting cast is generally solid. Bruce Greenwood brings natural command presence, the kind that makes a room instantly feel like his the moment he enters it. Max Martini adds toughness and personality to the soldier ranks. The rest of the ensemble helps sell the feeling of a real team, even though the script rarely gives most of them enough individuality to be truly memorable. That's the main limitation across the board. The actors are better than the characters. There's a solid ensemble here, but the film often treats them as functional pieces in an action machine. The commander gives orders, the soldiers argue with the civilian, the CIA agent supplies intelligence, the scientist solves the problem. Everyone has a role, but not everyone has an inner life. That doesn't sink the film, because Spectral is built more around situation than character. The cast clearly understands the assignment. They keep things moving, take the threat seriously, and none of them seem embarrassed by the material, which matters in a movie where invisible energy ghosts are killing soldiers in a ruined city. Had the actors winked at the audience or played things too broadly, the whole thing could have fallen apart. Instead, most of them commit fully to the tone. The film often plays like a military shooter campaign. Structurally, a mission goes wrong, the squad retreats, new intel surfaces, better gear gets built, the team returns for a bigger objective, and you can almost picture the levels loading one after another. Sometimes that works in the film's favor, giving it a clean forward drive with characters always working toward an immediate goal: reach this location, survive this attack, rescue these people, gather data, build weapons, stop the source. It's easy to follow and gives the action simple momentum, but it also makes parts of the story feel mechanical. The weapon building sequences especially carry that game-like rhythm, where the heroes conveniently unlock the right tools right before the final encounter. Entertaining, yes, but not exactly subtle. You can practically feel the film moving from one mission checkpoint to the next. None of that makes Spectral bad, it just makes it familiar. And that familiarity is simultaneously the film's comfort and its weakness. If you enjoy military sci-fi, there's real satisfaction in seeing all these ingredients combined: soldiers versus an impossible enemy, science trying to explain horror, heavy weaponry against something that ignores the normal rules, a ruined city, a desperate final push. These elements work because they've worked before, but that also means Spectral has to fight harder to feel distinctive. Its best original angle is the invisible, ghost-like threat seen through specialized military tech. That's what gives the film its identity, without which it would risk feeling like a cover version of better-known films. The specters are the one ingredient that keeps the whole mixture feeling a bit fresher than it otherwise would. Even so, the film doesn't try to hide its genre DNA. It's proudly assembled from familiar pieces, sometimes too proudly. There are moments where the references feel less like inspiration and more like the film working through a checklist of crowd-pleasing elements: elite soldiers, a mysterious enemy, child survivors, a ruined city, scientific explanation, improvised weapons, a final assault. The result is a film that's both derivative and watchable, a contradiction, Maybe, but it's exactly the space Spectral occupies. It borrows heavily, but from things that are genuinely entertaining. It doesn't always elevate those influences and definitely doesn't outclass them, but it clearly understands why those ideas appeal to audiences in the first place. So when people compare it to Aliens, Call of Duty, Final Fantasy, Battle, Los Angeles, Terminator, Starship Troopers, or Black Hawk Down, those comparisons aren't just name-dropping, they're baked into the viewing experience. Spectral feels like it was made by people who genuinely love military sci-fi, supernatural action, and high-tech combat scenarios. The catch is that love alone doesn't guarantee greatness. It guarantees energy, familiarity, and an easy watch on a lazy evening, while also reminding you, scene by scene, of the stronger films this one is drawing from. One of the stranger issues with Spectral is how it handles Moldova itself. To be fair, this isn't a film aiming for serious geopolitical drama. Nobody expects Spectral to deliver a deeply researched political thriller about Eastern Europe. The film mainly uses the location as a war-torn backdrop for its sci-fi story, and on that basic level, the setting does its job, providing ruined streets, armed conflict, foreign tension, and a reason for American troops to be there. Still, the details matter somewhat, and this is where the film starts feeling careless. The story places us in a Moldovan civil war with American troops supporting one side against insurgents or remnants of another faction, and the film paints the country as a dystopian, unstable, largely generic war zone, less like Moldova specifically and more like a Hollywood stand-in for a troubled Eastern European nation where military action can unfold without too many questions asked. That can be off-putting, because when a real country is used, even in a sci-fi action film, there's some baseline expectation of care, and Spectral doesn't always meet it. The political backdrop feels broad and simplified, built primarily to service the action rather than to explore who's fighting, why, or what the conflict actually means. And the film is far more interested in creating a damaged battlefield for ghost-like enemies to hunt soldiers in. For a movie like this, maybe that's not shocking, but it does leave the world feeling thinner. Some viewers have pointed out the film might have been better served inventing a fictional country entirely. A reasonable point, since the film is already inventing so much strange science and questionable conflict and language detail that anchoring it to a real nation adds little beyond an uncomfortable sense of using an actual country as a convenient dystopian backdrop. The language choices compound the issue. There are reports of Romanian, Russian, Moldovan, and even Slovene being handled inconsistently. One viewer noted that the Moldovan girl in the film wasn't actually speaking Moldovan but Slovene. Others flagged awkward or inaccurate Romanian and Russian adjacent elements. These may read as minor details to viewers unfamiliar with the languages, and many will likely never notice, but for those who do, it breaks the illusion. A reminder that this isn't really Moldova as a lived-in place, but Moldova as a production label, a mood, a war zone with a name attached. That's unfortunate, because the atmosphere is otherwise strong at the ruined city. The military hardware, the smoke, the abandoned industrial areas all combine into a genuinely convincing sense of danger. But when the cultural and political details feel off, the world beneath the surface loses some of its authenticity, becoming another example of the film looking more convincing than it actually is. The political framing has a similar problem, leaning into the familiar Hollywood template where American forces are positioned as the capable, serious presence inside a foreign conflict. Some viewers will read that as standard genre language. The troops are there, the situation is dire, the mission goes sideways, survival takes over. Others will find that framing too simplistic, and it's easy to understand why. Spectral isn't interested in interrogating the politics of intervention or asking uncomfortable questions about who belongs in that conflict or how the local population views the presence of foreign troops. It just wants a battlefield. So the politics become window dressing that shapes the film without deepening it. That might be easier to overlook if the rest of the story carried more emotional development. But with characters that are already fairly generic and world-building that isn't especially deep, these authenticity gaps stand out more than they otherwise would. The film wants its setting to feel gritty and real, but it doesn't always back that grit with believable cultural or political texture, creating an odd contrast. The tanks, weapons, and destroyed city all look and feel polished. The soldiers move through the environment with real conviction, and then the language or political shorthand reminds you that the world wasn't built with the same level of care. That's not enough to sink the film, especially for viewers watching primarily for action and effects. Most people won't clock whether the language is accurate or whether the political setup holds together, and they'll simply take in a convincing war zone, understand the stakes, and move on. But these small inconsistencies matter, because they're what keep Spectral from feeling fully complete. They're minor cracks, not catastrophic ones, but noticeable enough to stop the film from rising above its genre formula into something more fully convincing. With a bit more care in its setting, the entire world might have felt sharper and more grounded. Instead, Moldova becomes less a real place and more a convenient stage, a damaged city for soldiers to run through, a vague conflict for the plot to stand on, a serious-looking foreign backdrop that isn't always properly understood, and a film already contending with thin characters and shaky internal logic. That lack of authenticity reinforces the broader sense that Spectral is stronger in presentation than in foundation. It knows how to construct the look of a war-torn world, it just doesn't always know how to make that world feel true. By the time Spectral wraps up, the takeaway is pretty clear. This isn't a great film, but it isn't a bad one either. It occupies that middle zone where the flaws are visible almost the entire runtime, yet you keep watching anyway, because the core idea is strong enough and the presentation exceeds expectations.